Hello everyone, this is Defense Politics Asia, and this is the operational report for the Russian operations in Ukraine. And so I want to cover basically what the Russians are basically doing nowadays. And for those that are following my sitrep, you probably can tell the Russians are actually mainly conducting defensive operations along the Zaporizhzhia front, and they are holding the line along in the Kayamsky sector, the Orikhiv sector, and let's talk about this part first. And the tactic the Russians are doing is actually that they'll do their best they do what they could to maybe hold the line. As the Ukrainians attack gets too fierce, they'll withdraw, and then they'll regroup with reinforcement, and then they'll do a counter-attack. And before the counter-attack, they will actually start with a major artillery shelling of the Ukrainian forces, and then they push in. They also be supported by airstrikes, and this allows the Russian forces to actually successfully recapture grounds that they lose to the Ukrainians. And this is like a honey trap, because the Ukrainians desperately wants to capture grounds as they make massive push to capture grounds, and the Russians, once they feel like this push is too saturated, they will withdraw. They'll shell them, and then they will come back. And as they shell them, the Ukrainians actually will lose capabilities to even evacuate their wounded, and it's actually quite bad if you actually believe some of the anecdotes that's coming out from the battlefield. And some of these attacks from the Ukrainians are actually pretty costly, and the Russian forces made a point to make sure that it's very costly. Over at the Orikhiv sector, as you can see, the defense line actually there was a defense line here which is already overrun, and so the other defense line is actually here, and the rest will be the first line of defense further along the Robotine. The Ukrainian forces are pushing south of Novodanilivka, and the Russian forces, as I mentioned earlier, over at the Kayamsky sector, they do redraw initially, and then once the Ukrainians go into the where the Russians were, the Russians then shell them. They will just hit them with air strikes and artillery strikes. And once that is done, the Russian forces returns with regroup forces and counterattack, and the Ukrainian forces will be then kicked out of where they just captured. And this happened also within Novodanilivka, and this to and fro thing can happen, according to some sources, multiple times a day. And so this is actually quite bad. And in the other places like south of Tomashka, there is a Russian positions here, and the Ukrainian forces can't manage to break through this actual proper defense line. This is actually one of the very few defense line that is actually entrenched. If you look at Kayamsky sector, the first entrenchment is actually at Zarebianke. This is actually the proper entrenchment. The rest are all further in the east. Further in the west, and there's another in the southeast of Piatikaki. Piatikaki itself is not a defensive position. So when the Ukrainians actually push in, they are not even dealing with the actual defense line of the Russians, and they are already struggling to capture the town. So and we can tell, from the south of Tomashka, the Russian lines just holds. It just holds. And over at the Novoporovska, this is a settlement, and I think the Russians do have a pretty good defense within the settlement. The entrenchment is not noted at Novoporovska, but most likely there is going to be defenses within there. The Ukrainians have been trying to attack Novoporovska for quite a few times already. So far, the fighting still mainly is within this area here, not really within the settlement yet. So the Ukrainians' offensive over at the Orikhiv sector is a disaster as well. And the Russians are also particularly successful over at the Velika Novosilka sector. And the Russian forces lines over at Levatny, Novodarivka, Rifnopil, around Staromayoske, Urudzany, and over to Kermanchik and Novodonetsky. This entire defense line holds very strong. very strong. The Ukrainian forces have been attempting multiple attacks from multiple sector, and the only part that the Ukrainians are able to capture any ground is actually in this area here, because there is actually no defense lines around here. This area is actually a open territory. The Ukrainians can actually move freely over this area, and there will be just scattered Russian forces that is actually fighting with them, and then most of the time they're just getting shelled by the Russians, by artillery or by airstrikes. And you can see that based on this information coming from the Vostok group of forces, army aviation, basically the helicopters or airstrikes or flamethrower systems that are all fired at the Ukrainians that is trying to move through this area over here. So so the defense line is basically just holding. In particular, interesting is that Makarivka. So we have a lot of fighting around Makarivka over the past week, and the Ukrainians have managed to somewhat secure the place, and they have previously tried to attack towards Staromayorsky, but the defense line over the forest line here, there is a forest line here that is holding very, very well. And not just this forest line, the entire high ground here, just west of Makarivka, is entirely controlled by the Russian forces, and this high ground allows the Russians to have a perfect operational control over the village. So when the Ukrainian forces actually drive through into Makarivka trying to do assault operations, they just got fired upon, and it's probably quite bad because there is actually no reports of fighting around Staromayorsky or even at Makarivka. The only information that I'm seeing is actually from Ryba, where they simply reported what I said about the high ground firing on the Ukrainians. So given that the Ukrainians are attacking at all locations, if you look at all the icons, Makarivka stood out as a sore thumb because this is the area that the Ukrainians are not attacking. It's not, I think that it's not that they are not attacking, but the Russians' defense line over at Makarivka is just too successful. The Ukrainians have to capture this area here, but the Russians are not going to let them. So that's for the Velika Novosilka sector. And then the Russians actually, while the Ukrainians are doing their offensive, actually launched their own offensive as well. In particular, we are talking about the Marinka sector, where the Russian forces are attacking as usual within Marinka, but also against Boyeda and south of Marinka in the north of Novomikhailivka, in this area here. And in particular, the Russian forces have captured this stronghold here. This stronghold is called the Menegari. This is captured by the Russian forces, and with this line captured, I mean this fortified position captured, the Russian forces now have a forward operating base that they can use to actually attack in all these different sector. They can expand their control, and then they can actually close in on Novomikhailivka from the north. And the southern part is a bit unclear, the front line, so don't take this with a pinch of salt. But this actually allows, because there's no settlement around here. Oh my god, I keep pulling the borders. So there's no settlements around here. So this fortified position is utterly important for the Russians to capture in order to launch further attacks into this region here, which is actually all pretty heavily entrenched. And the Russians are also seemingly attacking in the eastern part of Avdiivka in another offensive. Fighting is reported from the Kayamka and Krutabalka sector. They are pushing in this area here. However, for the rest of the Avdiivka front, Ukrainians are on the offensive. The Ukrainians are doing this massive attack to cut off the pincer, the previous Russian pincer. They want this area here. They want to cut off this too, but the Russians are pushing in from the center. So this is going to make up for a very interesting strategic chess play around the Avdiivka region, and we're going to see how this develop over the next week or two. And over at the Bakhmut front, the Russians are not conducting any operations. They are just on the defensive, and The Russians, however, are actually doing some offensive operation over at Sperne and Bilohorivka. Fighting is reported in this area here, and perhaps even towards Kryhorivka in this area here. The feeling I get is not a proper full offensive. It feels more like a diversionary to draw Ukrainian forces away from the other front lines that the Russians care more about. But we shall continue to see. The Sivas has traditionally been really difficult for the Russians to fight in. So yeah, I wouldn't mind too much about that. The Russians also seems to have launched a major offensive west of Kreminna with attacks going towards Yampolivka, Torske, and the west of Dibrova. The information came from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry reporting this massive push. However, because it's Ukrainian Defense Ministry, we do have to take this with a pinch of salt, but it does seem like a major push from the sounds of it. And otherwise, the Russians are not exactly conducting any other offensive operations. There are some skirmishes around the Svatove front at Berestove and Novosilka, Kuzemivka region, but there's nothing more. The Russians are not pushing over at the Kupiansk front nor the Voreshna sector. The salient remains. The Russians still have the salient across the river. Sorry, over here. Which they can still threaten the pincer around Voreshna, but it looks like the Russians are not interested to do that just yet. So the situation currently still remains, I would say, largely still on the advantage for the Russians. The Russians are still on the upper hand. They have superior air defense, superior air superiority, superior artillery. I think they seem to also have more troops, and they have a better type of artillery system, like they have the TOS-1A flamethrower system, and they've managed to have as many drones or more drones than the Ukrainians, which is a rarity because the Ukrainians had more drones for most of this war, and now we are seeing that the Russians actually have a lot more of these remote control drones, and they are wreaking havoc on the Ukrainian lines, just like how the Ukrainians have been doing it to the Russians. So we will continue to monitor how the Russians operation goes, but it looks like the Russian tactics is working. The entire strategy of holding the lines and drawing the Ukrainian forces into certain kill zones where it feels easier for Ukrainians to have certain wins, but it's actually a trap. It feels like it. I'm not saying that it is, but I'm just saying that it feels like it. And I think this is going to bring this offensive to an end much faster. So far, the Ukrainians definitely still gonna have it's not over yet. They still have a lot of reserve. As far as I can tell, there's probably only 4 full brigades in the offensive right now. There's still 8 more assault offensive brigades that is still not deployed yet, because their equipments are not here yet. The Abrams tanks, the Leopard 1s are all not here yet. So the Ukrainians are launching an offensive with whatever they have, and it's not working out. And they're not even at the first line of defense on the Russian side. So the Russians are doing very well right now. Anyway, this is the operational report on the Russian operations in Ukraine. And do subscribe, press the like button, and I'll see you in the next update.